Almost every relationship has a breaking point, right? Whether it's a lifelong friendship, whether it's a once strong marriage, whether it's a oak solid business partnership, or even if it's one of those neighbors that we've been friends with for 30 years and we just really click. Every relationship has a breaking point. Every relationship runs the risk of having one person in that relationship say, I've had enough, quit the relationship, and check out. Right? It's a risk for any relationship. But does God have a breaking point? Can we do something so terrible or become someone so awful and villainous that suddenly we hit this magic threshold where God says, that's the breaking point, I'm done with you, the relationship is over, God quits on us? What do you think? Can that happen? Let me tell you a few stories. See what you think. Story number one, at 42, he had it all. He was a successful lawyer with a fancy downtown office. He had a loving wife. He had 2 beautiful daughters. As his practice grew, so too did his wealth, until one day he bought his dream home on a lake. He was, as they used to say in South Carolina, living in high cotton. But things weren't all that rosy. With his growing fame and fortune came increasing reckless decisions. Late night drinking and carousing led to a substance abuse problem, and then to an extramarital affair. And then in 24 short months, his whole world began to come apart at the seams. In 24 months, he turned his back on his God, on his church, on his family, even on his law practice. He continued to spiral out of control until one day he found himself in rehab, racked with guilt, asking, has God quit on me because of all my terrible decisions? Story number 2. The husband of a 38-year-old woman suddenly dies, tragically from a blood clot that developed after routine knee surgery. After the shock subsides, this new widow grows angry, especially with God. Her well-ordered, comfortable lifestyle has been turned completely upside down, and she's bitter. Bitter with a God who she can't understand would let such a senseless act happen. In anger, she does some things she regrets. One night she stays up late in the backyard yelling at God, even cursing God's name. One particular dark night, when the anger and the loneliness are most acute, she goes to the backyard to try to start a Bible on fire. But then, as her rage begins to subside, she begins to wonder, has God quit on me for all the terrible things that I have said and done these past months? Final story. A young religious extremist feels it is his duty to stamp out a newly formed religious cult. The cult is very small, but it's growing, it's gaining some popularity, and it's beginning to become a threat to the religion that this extremist practices. In time, he's put in charge of systematically trying to stamp out, even wipe out, this tiny little sect. He even oversees murdering of entire families of these people that are beginning to be called Christians. So what do you think? Do you think the Lord gave up on our hard-charging lawyer? What do you think? No? Yes? Think the Lord gave up on that grief-stricken 38-year-old widow? You think the Lord gave up on that religious terrorist who slaughtered innocent Christians? When does God give up on us? What's the threshold? When does God say enough is enough? People have been asking that question for millennia. And one person that was asking that question was the prophet Jeremiah. A very long time ago, Jeremiah was surrounded by people who were walking away from God left and right. And Jeremiah began asking the question, God, when are you going to give up on these people? God's answer came to Jeremiah during a visit to the local potter's house. So listen again as we look at the first verse of this passage that I read a little while ago from Jeremiah. In verse 1, the Lord commanded Jeremiah to arise and go down to the potter's house. There I will let you hear my words. So what do you think God wanted Jeremiah to see at the potter's house? I want you to think about that question, and I'm going to toss up again for just a minute the video that we showed at the beginning of service. It's a really cool video because it's a really primitive potter spinning in a very primitive way pottery. Probably the closest example to what Jeremiah would have seen down at the potter's house. So as we look at this video, I want you to ask yourself, what do you think God wanted Jeremiah to see at the potter's house? Take a look at this.
Wow, it's going really fast. Yeah. I only got as far as that size. It's an enormous piece of clay he's working on. See, this is the missing piece from what we were seeing yesterday. I couldn't understand how we
So what did Jeremiah see on the day that God said, go down to the potter's house? What did he see? What caught his imagination? It's important to know that in 7th century BCE, the potter's house was a fixture in every Jewish community. In Jeremiah's day, the potter's work was essential to the maintenance of everyday life. So as Jeremiah sat staring at the potter's wheel, he would have undoubtedly been reminded that pottery was necessary for everyday life. You see, clay pots back then, they weren't just ornamental. It wasn't just a luxury that we may use as we put decorative pieces on our mantle. Pottery was necessary. In fact, the invention of pottery set off a revolution, y'all. See, prior to pottery, people had to travel from one food source, one animal grouping, to the next, to the next, to the next. They were nomadic. They went from one group to the next in order for survival. But with the invention of pottery, people were allowed to stay put. They could hold water. They could hold grain. They could hold merchandise. They could hold and do cooking. In fact, the invention of pottery signaled a revolution that we call the rise of the Neolithic Age. So at the potter's house, Jeremiah would have seen somebody spinning pottery and who said, of course, pottery isn't just a luxury, it's essential. It's necessary. But he would have also saw pottery being spun, and he would have said every single piece, as beautiful as it is also unique. No two pieces of pottery are exactly the same. Listen to this quote by a Christian potter who connects her work and her faith. You can read along with me on the screen. She says, each piece of pottery, whether it stands alone or in a set, has to be unique. Even if the forms are alike, something about them will be different. The most beautiful aspect about clay, which fascinates me, is that you cannot exactly duplicate the piece. Just like no two lives are alike, no two clay pots are alike. If the difference in detail between them cannot be seen by the naked eye, the potter and the creator know what makes them unique. Isn't that cool? At the potter's house, Jeremiah saw clay pots that were both necessary and uniquely beautiful. So the first lesson that Jeremiah learned at the potter's house is that in the eyes of God, all of us, every single one of us, are necessary and uniquely beautiful. So if you're here today and you're asking, or if you know anybody in your life that's asking, is God ready to give up on me? The first lesson from Jeremiah is God sees you as necessary and uniquely beautiful vessel. Well, God was going to show Jeremiah a couple of other things. In verse 4, Jeremiah saw that the vessel that the potter was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand. And he reworked it into another vessel as seemed good to the potter. Jeremiah saw that sometimes clay resists the work of the potter, and it needs to be broken down. And for Jeremiah, that was a revelation. That was a huge observation for Jeremiah, because the prophet lived with people who were wandering away from God left and right. He lived with people who needed to be broken down and then remolded and remade. Jeremiah lived and preached to some people who were spoiled clay pots with impurities and bad habits and self-indulgent flaws. Jeremiah lived with people who were broken clay pots. Life had chipped away at them, and they needed to be healed and restored. Other people were like clay pots that had lost their usefulness. They had abandoned their God, they had abandoned their calling, and God needed to completely break them down and remold them. The second lesson that Jeremiah learned at the potter's house was really good news for all of us. It's the good news that God never, ever, ever gives up on us. Never. Sometimes we develop rough edges that need to be smoothed over, right? Present company excluded. Sometimes life breaks us and we become crackpots, right? Sometimes we make such a mess of things, or we've walked so far away from the Lord, that we need to be completely remolded and made and built back up. Is that where any of you are today? Maybe you need to be smoothed over by the potter's hand. Maybe the harsh realities of life have been chipping away at you, leaving you angry, bitter, toxic. Or maybe life is broken, you need to be healed and remade. Or maybe you just need a spiritual redo. Friends, the good news of the gospel is that we are all on the potter's wheel. All the time. Without question. God is never done with us. We are on the potter's wheel, being shaped and molded into necessary and beautiful vessels for God. The question is, will we give God control of our life? Will we let the molding and the reshaping and the healing happen, or will we resist? One final lesson Jeremiah learned at the potter's house. There's a profound image. It's recorded in verse 6. It says, just like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. Jeremiah realized at that moment that God's hands are always at work, even when we fail to see it, even when we fail to feel it or understand it or comprehend it. God's hands are always molding and always shaping us into eternal purposes. And this is the best news of all from the potter's house. We are always, always, always in God's hand. We may not feel it all the time. I don't. We may not even want to be there sometimes. Maybe say, God, just leave me alone. We may actually resist being on the potter's wheel, in the hand of God. But God always has us on the wheel. Always spinning. Always molding. Always shaping and reshaping. Healing. Smoothing. Making us into the necessary and uniquely beautiful people that God knows us and created us to be. So God sent Jeremiah the prophet down to the potter's house so that he could tell people who needed to hear this, God will never, ever, ever give up on you. You're always on the wheel. Don't resist. Remember that fire-breathing terrorist we spoke about earlier? Remember him? Tortured, killed Christians? God didn't give up on him, did he? No. One day while traveling to Damascus to kill more Christians, in a flash of light, the voice of God appeared to this awful man and said, Saul, why do you persecute me? Saul knew that he was on the potter's wheel. And God began the process of reshaping him into the man we know as the Apostle Paul, who started more churches and has written more books in our New Testament than anybody else. God doesn't give up on us. Remember that 42-year-old lawyer I spoke about? In the midst of rehab, which often happens in rehab, he realized he was on the potter's wheel. And God was shaping him and reshaping him and making him into a different person. And when he left rehab, he reconciled with his wife, with his law partner, with his church, with his Lord. And he went on to become one of the most respected individuals in the community, committing himself to defending the last, the least, the lost, and the lonely in the community. He went on to become an elder in his church and a beloved man because God didn't give up on him. Remember that 38-year-old widow, angry at God for losing her husband? Well, 3 years after that tragedy, she went out on a blind date. She went out on a blind date with, of all people, a pastor. A really handsome pastor. A Presbyterian pastor of all things. They dated and courted and fell in love. And they got married. God wasn't done using her because I'm told that she's helping plant a new church somewhere in Wilmington, North Carolina. This is the good news of the gospel. God is never done with us. And when we allow God to shape us on the potter's wheel, we become necessary and beautiful, and we discover the extraordinary life God has for us. And friends, that's the good news of the gospel. Thanks be to God. Let's pray.